Hello, and welcome to History on Blast, episode 23. 1 if by land, and 2 if I get arrested. I'm Hillary, and I'll be your host this week as we put Paul Revere on blast for getting all the credit despite getting arrested. But first, this month in history. On April 3rd, 1860, the Pony Express service began as the first rider departed St. Joseph, Missouri. Back then, it cost $5 an ounce to send a letter by Pony Express rider. Each rider would take on 75 to 100 miles of the 2,000-mile journey before passing the mail on to the next rider at one of the 190 stations along the route to California. Despite how ubiquitous the image of the Pony Express is, even to this day, it actually only lasted about less than 2 years, because by then, the telegraph lines were up, and we didn't need to go by horse anymore, because telegraphs are cheaper and faster and safer. So, before we get back to putting Paul Revere on blast, I've got another message from our friends over at Tone Deaf.
Hey Warren.
Hey Kay.
Did you know that Cats and Les Mis are sung through musicals? And did you know that the musical Guys and Dolls was written by the same guy who wrote Baby It's Cold Outside?
I have no idea what any of those words mean.
Warren, we covered this on Tone Deaf last week.
I don't remember what I had for breakfast last week. You expect me to remember musicals last week?
Listen to Tone Deaf, a theater nerd's guide for their musically challenged spouse, and expand your knowledge of musical theater.
Or just laugh as I struggle to remember that one show about the Cobras.
I still have no idea what you're talking about.
Tune in every Wednesday to Tone Deaf.
Before I get too much into Paul Revere, there's something I want to bring up first. And that is that having grown up in Massachusetts and gone to school in the Massachusetts public school system, I have heard more about Paul Revere than any person really should, or, really about any of the revolutionary activities that took place in Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but in particular Paul Revere. And that is for one reason, and one reason only. And that's because there's a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And really, if there's one thing that elementary school teachers love more than a locally pertinent historical topic that they can actually take us to the places and tell us about the things, it's something that has a nice poem put to it. Even if that poem is, let's go with only mostly factually correct. Because, as I may have alluded to, Paul Revere didn't actually finish his midnight ride that he's so famous for. He in fact got arrested by the British. There were also 3 riders. So let's start with the poem, and then we'll pick things apart from there, shall we? Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. 1 if by land, and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Then he said good night, and with a muffled oar, silently rowed to the Charlestown shore, just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset British man-o'-war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed to the tower of the church, up the wooden stairs with a stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade, by the trembling ladder steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath in the churchyard laid the dead, in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went, creeping along from tent to tent and seeming to whisper, "All is well." A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead, for suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed on the landscape far and near, then impetuous stamped the earth and turned and tightened his saddle girth, but mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the Old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hoofs in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in passing a spark, struck out by a steed that flies fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean tides, and under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises when the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting-house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown, and one was safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest in the books you have read, how the British regulars fires and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball, and from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road, only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Whew! So, that's the poem. And let's talk about the historical inaccuracies, shall we say. First off, to start off with, Paul Revere was not the only rider. There were actually 3 separate riders on the midnight ride. One of these is actually kind of funny. So it starts out, and it was going to be Paul Revere and William Dawes as the 2 riders. And then along the way, they were also accompanied by Samuel Prescott, a doctor from Lexington, who was, shall we say, returning from a lady friend's house at the awkward hour of 1 a.m., as they say in the historical record. Another detail that they leave out of the poem is that the friend who is mentioned, who hangs the lanterns in the belfry of the Old North Church, was a man by the name of Robert Newman, and he was the sexton of that church, which is how he could get into the bell tower in the middle of the night. The ride itself, the path is more or less correct. It went through Somerville, Medford, Arlington, and then off to Lexington and Concord. But here's where things differ from the poem. Revere, Dawes, and Prescott arrived in the town of Lincoln on their way to Concord, and they encountered a patrol of British regulars at a roadblock and were stopped. Prescott jumped his horse over the wall and managed to escape and continue on to reach Concord to spread the message. Dawes also escaped, but unfortunately fell off his horse. So just to make sure we're all keeping up here, of the two original riders, both of them failed to make it to Concord because Revere got his ass arrested. Because while Dawes and Prescott jumped over this blockade and kept going, and okay, sure, Dawes then fell off his horse and didn't make it to Concord, but Revere didn't even manage to jump the blockade. He out and out got arrested and then proceeded to spend most of the rest of the night sassing the British. Because they were like, all right, explain what you were doing. And he was like, oh, well, I'm headed off to Concord to warn them that you're coming because you're not gonna get our guns, is more or less how that goes. And the British were like, well, that's odd, but okay, I guess. Weird flex, but sure. At which point, they hear gunfire off in the woods, and they're like, what was that? And Paul Revere's like, aha! That's part of our clever alerting alarm system to make sure that everyone in the countryside knows that you're on the way, so we can personally say, fuck you all. At which point, the British were like, this is actually kind of, potentially a problem. So they decided to free the prisoners because they didn't want to deal with it, let Revere go, but confiscated his horse and used it to go warn the British column that the colonists were, like, in open revolt at this point, and that the marching column should expect to be met by force and not just, vague protest. At which point Paul Revere starts walking from Lincoln to Concord. Which, okay, sure, not all that far, but would have been a lot faster if he had a horse. He does somehow get to Reverend Jonas Clark's house, where Hancock and Adams are staying, to still warn them to get out because the British are coming. Or, as they actually would have said, because this is actually a pet peeve of mine, the colonists at no point in time would have been yelling, the British are coming, the British are coming. They are British. At this point, the colonists don't think of themselves as Americans. They are very much still of the backgrounds that they were when they moved here. Or if they were born here, they still probably think of themselves as British citizens, but, they think of themselves as, yes, I am a British citizen from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Not, I'm not American. Things like that. So what they actually would have been yelling on this ride to go warn people, and it wouldn't have just been general yelling, because then you come across the problem of warning the Tories who support the crown that, the rebels are up to something. It would actually have been a much more secret symbol. You have these mysterious gunshots in the night that mean something to the members of the militia. You have people showing up at the door to knock on it to tell you, you as a member of the militia, we need you to turn out. And things like that. But what they actually would have been saying is the regulars are coming. Because they were referring to the regular British Army, aka the Redcoats, aka the standing British Army, as opposed to the militias, which were still British colonial militias. Now, this system that they were using, that they triggered, the Minuteman militia system, was a system of arm and muster that they had actually developed well before. It was actually developed early in before the French and Indian War. It was developed as a means of organizing a common militia to an immediate threat. And what it allowed for is you could send out a few riders and they would spread out. One rider would go and tell the people that they were along their route, and the people along their route would then also spread out and make sure the rest of the local militia was aware, so that a rider could go through a main town, and the people in that town would then spread out and let the local farmers know. It's actually a very well-organized system, and it's what leads to the colonial militias being called Minutemen because of how quickly they could arrive to a scene. And in this case, the scene that they arrive on is the Lexington Green, which leads to the shot heard round the world and the start of the American Revolution, which... I say those words and I almost immediately get a Schoolhouse Rock song stuck in my head. One, in fact, that talks about Paul Revere. So that's just about going to do it for us today. As always, if you have any comments or feedback or questions, you can find me at historyonblast@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter at historyonblast. You can check out the Facebook group, which is the History on Blast discussion group. It's a fun time. I'd also like to thank our friends over at Tone Deaf once again. Be sure to go check them out. And I'd like to thank Defy Them All for the use of their song Keeper of Histories for the intro and outro of our program. And as always, thank you for listening.